The Legend of the Virgin's Jewel. A story by Nick Joaquin. The first time Brother Fernando noticed the bowl of milk, he had been too busy to wonder. He was new to the country, having just arrived from Spain in this year of our Lord 1620, and too engrossed in his duties as brother sacristan of the convent of Santo Domingo, to worry a bowl of milk at the foot of a tree. The next day, in the evening, while tidying up in the sacristy, he heard voices and a flute. Those would be the goatherds coming home. The convent depended for milk on a flock of goats, which was pastured daily outside the city, in the cluster of groves known as La Ermita. Brother Fernando smiled to hear the flute and the tramping of goats along the cobbled street. He was reminded of childhood evenings at Alcalá de Henares. He crossed to a window. The sacristy was separated from the street by a small patio enclosed by a high wall. The patio was paved, except for a space in the center, where, ancient and horrible, a massive baleti tree silently wrestled with itself, overspreading the courtyard, its tormented coils, movelessly writhing. Out in the street, the goatherds seemed to have paused. Then a door in the wall opened, and an old man stepped into the patio. He carried a bowl of milk and a handful of flowers. Through the door, the man left a jar. Brother Fernando could see the goats writhing outside, milling around the legs of a little boy. The old man walked straight to the tree. He bowed low, set down the bowl of milk, and scattered the flowers around it. Then he pulled out a bamboo flute and, tripping around the tree, softly piped a little ghost of tune. It was very sad and monotonous, yet somehow frightening. The tune finished, the old man bowed low again. Then he walked out of the patio, closing the door behind him. The night was warm, but Brother Fernando found himself shivering. He could not take his eyes off the faintly gleaming bowl on the ground. Before heading the call to the religious life, he had been a soldier, had fought in the lowlands, in Italy, and among the jungles of the Americas. He had suddenly turned friar in his middle age, not because he was sated with adventure, but because he was insatiable, and now turned to the spiritual domain and newer sensations and profounder adventures. Wherever he had found himself, as soldier or as a friar, he has his foot down with confidence of native, Spain and mistress of the world, and all the earth was Spanish earth. But as he stood beside the sacristy window and stared into the total darkness of the patio, he felt terrified, lost and terrified, and an alien. Spain, Europe, and the world of Christians' usage was far away. For the first time in his life, he felt desperately homesick for the chimneys of old Alcalá de Henares. But when he woke up the next day, the error that had oppressed him all night vanished. He chuckled to himself as he dressed. He was getting old, he thought, and he hurried down to the sacristy. He must be in the patio when the goatherd came for his bowl. He meant to have a little talk with that old man.
Look, the milk you left last night. Here, it still is in the bowl. See how no one has touched it. And why? Because you offered it to something that is not there, that does not exist. That's nothing.
Smiling, Brother Fernando opened the door to the patio, but as he stepped out, the smile split open on his lips. Under the tree stood the bowl. It was empty. The next moment he heard footsteps in the street. The door in the wall opened and the old man came in, walked straight to the tree and picked up the bowl. Only then did he notice the friar standing at the sacristy door. He hesitated, then smiled and bowed. Brother Fernando, very pale, bowed in answer. Sunlight fell on the scene. The old man smiling under the tree, the bowl very white in his brown hands, and behind him, the boy and goats waiting. But as he gazed, Brother Fernando felt cold again, and shivered. That night, our friar kept vigil in the sacristy. Pacing the floor, he said, his beads, clinging to them as to something familiar. A part of the world, a weapon against the nameless, ageless, and meaningless horror outside. He had witnessed again the little ceremony around the tree. Pausing at the window, he looked into a silent patio. A slip of moon was abroad. The tree let fall its light in slivers. Upon the pavement, the bowl shone. Terror tightened at the roots of his hair. He fled to the chapel. By the sanctuary light he could barely make out the Virgin on the altar. But her face soared out of the dusk, her fingers curved out of it. Her smile steadied him. This was before the days of her great miracles. Before the victories of 1646, she was not yet covered with precious stones. A poor queen, she reigned over a poor colony, clad in simple robes and wearing simple crown. Brother Fernando had seen the splendid virgins of Spain, fragrant with legends and resplendent with jewels. But tonight, the world of Christendom, the world of his childhood and of his father, was represented by his poor virgin, this colonial virgin, clad in simple robes and wearing a simple crown. She was history and tradition. She was familiar. Primeval terrors dissolved before her smile. So, he returned to the sacristy. The clock told midnight as he stood again at the window to watch the patio, but his eyes were misted with tears. It was his hometown that he saw, Alcala in autumn, and the storks croaking overhead. But no moonbeam flamed so abruptly into colors, its white heart burning now red, now blue, and the sparkling flames seemed to gather together, to crystallize, to make form. The wildfire hardened into a star, and the star pulsed along the ground, trailing a coiled shadow behind it. The shadow uncoiled, oozed longer and longer, took shape, glittered green and gold in the moonlight. Gripping the window bars, his face pressed against the bars, the sweat cold on his brow, the breath blocked in his chest, Brother Fernando watched an enormous jeweled serpent slide nearer and nearer the bowl of milk. It moved with haste, and greedily, its eyes glistening with evil, like peepholes into hell. The squat head rose radiant, for between its dripping jaws, the monster carried its jewel. Arrived at the bow, it poised its head high, swaying slightly as if listening. Then it ducked swiftly and spat the jewel on the ground. Coiling around and around the bowl, it began to sip the milk. Brother Fernando watched the horror and fascination. On the pavement, the jewel slumbered, a small rainbow arching above it. An eternity after, the monster reared its head again. The jaws yawned open, the fangs shot out, hissed and withdrew, the evil eyes glistened. The head swung round and round, searching. Suddenly it swooped down, with its open jaws at the jewel. Now, it's gliding away. The jewel burned aloft, blazed brighter and brighter, seemed to burst into flames, and to drench the faint moonlight with its 100 magical hues, but suddenly dimmed, faded away, and Brother Fernando was staring at a bleak patio, an empty bowl, a tree, and some shabby patches of moonlight. He awoke from a nightmare to find blurred faces hovering above him. He was in his bed, in his cell. It smelled of noon. His eyes ached, his head swirled, his flesh burned. The blurred faces spoke in blurred voices. The fever, he had the tropical fever, they said. He tried to tell them about the serpent, about the tree.
The tree must be chopped down,
He said. But the blurred faces swam before him. The blurred voices boomed and faded. The fever, he had the fever for 3 days, they said. How his body flamed in the mist. He felt hands lifting him up and the coolness on his neck and arms. He inquired what it was. It was the Virgin's veil, they told him. This was the Virgin's veil around him and he must pray for her, they said. He tried to recall the words of the prayer, but the whirling had slowed in his head, and sank into sleep. Sleeping, he heard her enter, was flooded with fragrance. He looked up and saw her standing at his side, clad in her simple robes and bearing her simple crown, but her face was not blurred. She spoke, and music filled the room. She asked how he felt, and why he had not called on her. But soon they were talking about his town of Alcala, about the woods, and the river, and the snows on the hills. And he grinned and chattered and laughed, was suddenly silent. Then he said how it pained him to the heart, Señora, to see her thus, clad so simply. But she smiled and shook her head and murmured that great souls were here jewels. He remained grave, however, he would find her a jewel. But she laughed, and called him a child, and leaning, laid a hand on his eyes. When he opened them again, it was night. The fever had left him. His body felt young and cool. Remembering what he had to do, he sprang up and ran to the window. It was not yet midnight, he saw. The moon had just risen. He dressed quickly. From his chest he drew a sword, the old sword of his soldier days. Downstairs in the chapel, the sword offered upon his palms. He prayed the Virgin to bless him and bless the sword. When midnight struck, he was standing in the shadow of the doorway, the moonlit patio before him. His foe was equally punctual. His serpent moved more slowly, pausing again and again in the moonlight. When it reached the bowl, it lifted its head and listened a long time. The eyes peered and peered. Brother Fernando held his breath and stood rigid, his eyes shut tight, lest they betray him. When he dared to look again, the serpent had set the jewel down, had coiled around the bowl, and was buying its jaws in the milk. He said a rapid prayer, crossed himself, and tiptoed forth. The pavement stung his bare feet. When he stood at last behind the beast, the beauty of the serpent astonished him. The embroidered coat was luxurious enough for king. In that instant, the beast smelled danger. The head shot up, swung around, swayed backward, and sprang, hissing at the friar. Down flashed the gleaming sword, and the serpent's head, severed, flew off, still hissing. But the tangled coil darted alive and sought to wind themselves around his legs. Down flashed the sword again, slicing through the writhing mass. Blindly through hands and with all his might, Brother Fernando hacked and hacked until the thick mass lay in chopped coils around him, still writhing in the spilled milk among the fragments of the bowl. He staggered to the doorway and leaned against the wall. He wanted to vomit and yet was unable to. But the jewel, he had forgotten about the jewel. He turned around with a cry, ran, and picked up the stone. It blazed in his palm. He sped through the sacristy and into the chapel. There, his strength failed him and he clung to a pillar, panting. "Here it is," he gasped, gazing up the altar. "Here it is, Mary," he panted, and waved the jewel aloft, and her faces soared out of the dusk, her fingers curved out of it. Her smile steadied him. "It is for you, my lady," he whispered, and laughed joyously. "It is for you, my mother." He sang, and tried to move and could not, but she was coming down herself. She had emerged from the altar. Very carefully, very softly, she descended, step by step, on invisible stairs. He cried out and hurried towards her. But suddenly he realized before whom he stood. He dropped to his knees, bowed low, and laid the jewel at her feet. Then, he swooned away. The end.